In certain cities, power does not announce itself. It does not need to. In Kobe, there is a compound that occupies an entire city block. It is gated, surveilled, and immaculate. No sign marks its purpose. No flag flies above it. And yet every police officer in the prefecture knows exactly what it is. Every construction firm, every entertainment company, every dock worker within 50 miles understands what happens behind those walls. The people who live in the surrounding neighborhoods walk past it every day without looking up. Not because they do not know, because they know too well. This is the headquarters of the Yamaguchi-gumi, the largest criminal organization in Japan and, by some measures, the largest organized crime syndicate the modern world has ever produced. At its peak, it commanded more than 30,000 sworn members, operated through hundreds of subsidiary families, and generated billions of dollars annually from construction, finance, narcotics, gambling, extortion, and enterprises so deeply embedded in the legitimate economy that the boundary between lawful and criminal became, for decades, almost meaningless. But the Yamaguchi-gumi is only one part of a much larger phenomenon. The Yakuza, as they are collectively known, represent something that has no precise equivalent anywhere else on Earth. They are not simply a criminal network. They are a parallel institution, one that has existed in various forms for more than 300 years, woven into the social, economic, and political fabric of Japan so thoroughly that removing them has proven to be one of the most difficult law enforcement challenges any modern democracy has ever faced. To understand how this happened, you have to go back to the beginning. Not to the founding of any single gang, but to the conditions that made organizations like these not only possible, but, in a certain grim sense, inevitable. During the Edo period, which lasted from 1603 to 1868, Japan was governed under a rigid feudal hierarchy. The Tokugawa shogunate enforced a strict caste system in which social mobility was virtually non-existent. At the very bottom of this order were the outcasts, the people who existed beneath even the lowest recognized class. Among them were two groups whose names would become synonymous with the criminal underworld that followed. The tekiya were itinerant peddlers, merchants who traveled between villages selling goods of dubious quality at markets and festivals. They were looked down upon, considered marginal, but they were organized. They formed hierarchies, assigned market stalls, charged fees for protection, and created internal systems of authority that mimicked the family structures of mainstream Japanese society. The boss was the oyabun, the father figure. His followers were koban, the children. Loyalty flowed upward, protection flowed down. The relationship was total. And it was binding. The bakuto were gamblers. Their social standing was even lower than the peddlers, because gambling was illegal. They operated in abandoned temples and makeshift gambling dens on the edges of towns, running dice games and card houses while providing loans to their patrons at punishing rates. The bakuto were responsible for some of the most enduring symbols of what would later become the Yakuza. The full-body tattoos, applied not with machines, but with handheld needles in a process that could take years and was deliberately painful, originated in bakuto culture. So did the name itself. Yakuza comes from a losing hand in a card game called Oicho Kabu. The cards 8, 9, and 3. Yakuza. Add up to 20. A worthless total. The word means, essentially, good for nothing. It was not a name chosen out of pride. It was a label worn as a kind of defiance. These two groups, the tekiya and the bakuto, merged over time. They adopted rituals from each other. They absorbed ronin, masterless samurai with no lord and no income. They recruited from the barakumin, the hereditary outcasts of Japanese society who were denied employment and social recognition. And they developed something that would become their most powerful tool, a code. The code was called jingi, and it governed everything. Loyalty to the oyabun was absolute. Betrayal was punished not with expulsion, but with violence or mutilation. The ritual of yubitsume, the cutting off of one's own fingertip as an act of atonement, was rooted in a practical reality. A samurai who lost the tip of his little finger could no longer grip a sword properly. For a yakuza, The act was a demonstration that his bond to the group mattered more than his own body. It is a ritual that persists to this day, though it has become less common among younger members, in part because a missing finger is an immediate identifier to police. By the time Japan began its rapid industrialization in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the Yakuza had already established a presence in labor markets, port operations, and street-level commerce. They were not yet the corporate-scale criminal enterprises they would later become, but they were embedded. They controlled dock workers. They ran rickshaw operations. They provided security at festivals and construction sites. And they had begun to develop something that would prove far more valuable than any particular racket: political connections. In the 1920s, when Japan introduced democratic reforms and leftist political movements began to gain traction, Yakuza groups were recruited by right-wing politicians and ultra-nationalist organizations to intimidate labor unions, break strikes, and suppress communist organizers. This was not a secret arrangement. It was an open, transactional relationship. The Yakuza provided muscle. The politicians provided protection from prosecution. Both sides understood the terms. This alliance between organized crime and political power would deepen over the following decades, surviving even the catastrophic disruption of the Second World War. The war changed everything and nothing. During the conflict, the traditional Yakuza structure was devastated. Members were drafted into the military. Revenue streams collapsed. Gambling houses and street markets shut down as the entire civilian economy was redirected toward the war effort. By the time Japan surrendered in August 1945, the old Yakuza order was in ruins. But what followed created conditions that were, in many ways, even more favorable for organized crime than what had existed before. The American occupation dismantled much of Japan's existing institutional framework. Police forces were decentralized and weakened. The economy was shattered. Food was scarce. And, in the vacuum, black markets exploded across the country. Whoever controlled the black markets controlled survival itself. In this chaos, a new generation of Yakuza bosses emerged. They were harder, more ambitious, and more willing to use violence than their predecessors. They were also more strategic. They understood that the post-war moment was not just an opportunity to make money, it was an opportunity to build something permanent. In Kobe, a man named Taoka Kazuo was watching all of this very carefully. Taoka had been born in 1913 on Shikoku, the smallest of Japan's 4 main islands. His father died before he could form any memory of the man. His mother died of a heart attack caused by overwork when he was 6. He was sent to live with an uncle who drank heavily and an aunt who showed him no affection. By the age of 14, he was working on the docks of Kobe while still attending school. It was at school that he befriended a boy named Yamaguchi-Hideo, whose older brother, Noboru, happened to be the leader of a gang called the Yamaguchi-Gumi. The gang had been founded in 1915 by Yamaguchi Harukichi, a former soldier and dock worker who had broken away from a larger Kobe-based Yakuza group called the Oshima-gumi, taking about 50 members with him. The Yamaguchi-gumi's early business was straightforward. They supplied laborers to the shipyards of Kobe, which was one of the busiest ports in Asia. They also, somewhat unusually, gained a reputation as performers of rokyoku, a form of narrative singing that was popular in early 20th century Japan. The gang grew steadily under its founder and then under his son Noboru, who expanded its port operations and its footprint in Kobe's entertainment industry. But no one could have predicted what the gang would become under its third leader. Taoka spent years working his way up from the lowest ranks. He ran errands. He fought. He earned a nickname, the Bear, for his ferocity in brawls and for a particular tendency toward extreme violence during confrontations. After 9 years of proving himself, he was finally initiated as a full member. Almost immediately afterward, he was sentenced to 8 years in prison for killing a member of a rival gang. He was released early, in 1943, into a Japan that was losing a war and a Yamaguchi-gumi that had been gutted. Both the founder and his son had died while Toka was incarcerated. The gang's membership had fallen to roughly 25 men. In October 1946, Tauka was named the third kumicho, the supreme boss, of the Yamaguchi-gumi. He inherited an organization that was barely functional in a city that had been virtually destroyed by American bombing. What he did next is not a story of criminal genius in the romantic sense. It is a case study in how a disciplined, ruthless individual can exploit institutional collapse to build an empire. His first move was into construction. Kobe, like much of urban Japan, needed to be rebuilt from the ground up. Taoka's men were disciplined workers. They were efficient. They were also violent enough to ensure that competing labor groups did not interfere. Construction provided steady, legitimate income and, more importantly, it provided access to the vast flows of government reconstruction money that were pouring into Japan's devastated cities. While construction secured the organization's financial base, Tauka was already expanding into gambling, extortion, and territorial warfare. He formed an alliance with a rival Kobe gang called the Honda Kai, a group of bakuto gamblers. When the alliance became inconvenient, he destroyed them. The Honda Kai was not merely defeated, it was absorbed. Its members either joined the Yamaguchi-gumi or they disappeared from Kobe's underworld entirely. Tauka then turned his attention to Osaka, Japan's second-largest city and a critical economic center. He defeated the Mayo-kai, a Korean gang, and the Miyamoto-kai, establishing a presence in a city that would become central to the Yamaguchi-gumi's operations for decades to come. But Tauka did not limit himself to criminal enterprises. He understood something that many of his contemporaries did not. That real power in post-war Japan required a presence in the legitimate economy. He created a talent agency that managed some of Japan's most famous entertainers, including the singer Misora Hibari and the comedian Inomoto Kenichi. He told his men to read economic newspapers and pay attention to the stock market. He was building not just a gang, but an institution, one that could operate simultaneously in the underworld and in the boardroom. By the mid-1960s, the scale of what Tauka had constructed was remarkable. The Yamaguchi-gumi controlled an estimated 80% of all cargo handled at the port of Kobe. Tauka owned 14 companies in the city that generated roughly $17 million annually in 1965 alone. 343 smaller Yakuza families had affiliated themselves with the Yamaguchi-gumi, bringing its total membership to approximately 10,000. The organization was no longer a gang, it was a conglomerate, and it operated with a structure that was, in its own way, as sophisticated as any legitimate corporation. At the top was the kumicho, whose authority was absolute. Below him was the wakagashira, the second in command, who supervised the organization's day-to-day operations. Below the wakagashira was the shatigashira, who served as a bridge between senior leadership and the mid-level bosses. And below all of them were the hundreds of affiliated families, each with its own oyabun, each running its own territory, each paying tribute upward while receiving protection and the right to operate under the Yamaguchi-gumi name. The system was feudal in design but corporate in execution. Loyalty was enforced not merely through tradition, but through economic dependency. A family that left the Yamaguchi-gumi lost access to its construction contracts, its port connections, its political protection, and its reputation. In most cases, leaving was not a realistic option. The methods by which the Yakuza maintained control were varied and, in certain respects, uniquely Japanese. Violence was always available, gang wars were frequent, and they were brutal. But the Yakuza also relied on something more subtle, the exploitation of social norms that placed an extraordinary premium on harmony, obligation, and the avoidance of public shame. The practice of sekiya is perhaps the clearest example. A sekiya operative would purchase a small number of shares in a major corporation, gaining access to its annual shareholder meeting. He would then research the company's executives, uncovering personal scandals, financial irregularities, or any information that could cause embarrassment if made public. The threat was simple: pay, or the information would be announced at the meeting, in front of shareholders, media, and competitors. The amounts demanded were often modest by corporate standards, a few $100,000, pocket change for a major Japanese firm. But the cost of refusal, Public humiliation, loss of face, potential damage to share price was considered far greater. By the mid-1970s, the National Police Agency reported that Yakuza groups were generating more revenue from corporate extortion than from any other single source. At its peak, there were more than 6,000 active Tekiya operatives in Japan. A third of them were confirmed Yakuza members. The rest operated in the gray space between legitimate business and organized crime, a space that in Japan was wider than almost anywhere else in the developed world. The Tekiya were not merely tolerated. In some cases, they were employed by the very corporations they extorted, hired to silence legitimate shareholders who asked inconvenient questions at meetings. In the notorious case involving the Chiso Chemical Company, which was responsible for the Minamata mercury poisoning disaster, Tekiya were reportedly used to shut down shareholder meetings within minutes, drowning out the protests of victims' families and environmental activists. The 1994 murder of Fujifilm's vice president, Juntaro Suzuki, who had stopped paying Tekiya bribes, demonstrated the lethal consequences that could follow when a company tried to break free. Beyond corporate extortion, the Yakuza's financial operations penetrated virtually every sector of the Japanese economy. Construction remained the foundation. Throughout the post-war decades, construction companies routinely worked with Yakuza-affiliated firms, either paying for protection from labor disruptions or subcontracting directly to Yakuza-controlled businesses. The relationship was so entrenched that, as one industry advisor later acknowledged, a good project manager was expected to smooth over local relations, which meant working with the Yakuza so there would be no trouble. Real estate was another major revenue stream, particularly during Japan's massive economic bubble of the 1980s. Yakuza groups were involved in land speculation and property acquisition through intimidation, using tactics where holdout property owners were pressured into selling through threats, harassment, or worse. The entertainment industry remained a significant source of both income and influence. Yakuza groups controlled nightclubs, bars, cabarets, and pachinko parlors across the country. They managed talent. They ran loan sharking operations that targeted gamblers, businessmen, and anyone else who found themselves in financial distress. And beginning in the late 1970s, the Yakuza moved aggressively into the narcotics trade. Methamphetamine became a massive source of revenue. The Yakuza controlled the supply chain from importation, often from Southeast Asia, Taiwan, or North Korea, to street-level distribution. By the late 1980s, police estimated that 85% of Yakuza organizations were involved in the drug trade in some capacity. Approximately half of all amphetamine-related arrests involved Yakuza affiliates. The drug trade was, for the many families, the single most profitable activity they conducted, and it was the one that inflicted the most damage on Japanese communities, fueling an epidemic of addiction that the government struggled for decades to contain. The political connections that the Yakuza had cultivated since the pre-war era only deepened as the organization's economic power grew. Kono Ichiro, who served as Minister of Transportation and later as Deputy Prime Minister, provided political backing to Taioka's companies. Kodama Yoshio, a right-wing power broker with deep ties to Japan's political establishment, attempted to create a nationwide alliance of Yakuza groups in the 1960s, envisioning something close to a unified criminal government. That vision was never fully realized, but Kodama did broker alliances between the Yamaguchi-gumi and several powerful Eastern Yakuza groups, including the Inagawa-kai, Tokyo's largest syndicate. The alliance was consecrated in 1972 through the traditional sake cup ritual, in which unglazed ceremonial cups are shared, then wrapped in paper and placed inside the kimono, a centuries-old tradition signifying a bond of brotherhood between organizations. With the Yamaguchi-gumi and the Inagawa-kai joined, there were only 4 of Japan's 47 prefectures that remained entirely free of their combined influence. The relationship between the Yakuza and the Japanese state was not one of simple corruption, where criminals bribed officials to look the other way. It was something more structural. For decades, there existed an unwritten understanding between the Yakuza, the police, and the political establishment. The Yakuza were permitted to operate their businesses, run their rackets, and even conduct their internal wars, provided they kept the violence contained within the underworld and did not endanger ordinary citizens. The police, in exchange, maintained a degree of order by knowing exactly who the criminals were, where they operated, and what they controlled. The Yakuza even had offices with nameplates on the door. They printed business cards. They published fan magazines. They were, in a phrase that would be difficult to translate into any other country's experience, a regulated criminal industry. But no system built on violence and silence remained stable forever. Inside the Yamaguchi-gumi, the pressures that had been building for years finally cracked open in the 1980s. The first serious crisis came from within. In July 1978, Taoka was shot in the neck by a member of a rival Kansai gang while sitting in a Kyoto nightclub. He survived, but the assassination attempt exposed a vulnerability that his enemies had long suspected. Taoka was aging, his health was failing, and there was no clear succession plan. A generation gap had opened inside the organization. The youngest members had grown up in a very different Japan than Taoka. They were less disciplined, less patient, and less inclined to follow the old rules. One of the most fundamental of those rules, that gang wars must never be conducted in public view, was being broken with increasing frequency. Street violence was spilling into civilian spaces. The Japanese public, which had tolerated the Yakuza's existence for decades, was growing tired of it. The police responded with an unprecedented 80-day crackdown, mobilizing 1,100 officers who arrested 2,000 gang members, including 518 senior figures. The Yamaguchi-gumi's second highest-ranking member, Yamamoto Kenichi, was arrested and sentenced to 3.5 years in prison. Taoka attempted to calm the situation by making peace with rival gangs and even holding an official press conference, something virtually unheard of in the Yakuza world. But the underlying tensions remained unresolved. In July of 1981, Taoka suffered a heart attack and died at the age of 68. He had led the Yamaguchi-gumi for 35 years, during which time he had transformed it from a depleted local gang of 25 men into the most powerful criminal organization in Japan, generating an estimated $460 million per year. His funeral, held despite police warnings against a public ceremony, drew 1,300 Yakuza members from 200 different gangs. Famous entertainers attended. A singer who had been managed by Taoka's agency eulogized him publicly. The spectacle was a demonstration of the organization's reach, but it also marked the beginning of a period of instability that would test whether the Yamaguchi-gumi could survive without the man who had built it. The succession was bitterly contested. Taoka's preferred heir, Yamamoto Kenichi, was in prison at the time of the boss's death and died of liver disease shortly after his release. In a move that was almost unprecedented in the Yakuza world, Taoka's widow, Fumiko, was appointed as an interim leader. She was respected by many senior members and was, by all accounts, a capable administrator. But the field of organized crime in Japan was dominated by men who did not easily accept a woman's authority, regardless of her competence. Eventually, an election was held among the organization's 104 family bosses. Two candidates emerged. Takanaka Masahisa, a longtime friend of the Taoka family known for his aggressive temperament and popularity among the rank and file, won decisively. His opponent, Yamamoto Hiroshi, a relative of Taoka's late right-hand man, refused to accept the result. He left the Yamaguchi-gumi, taking approximately half its membership with him, and formed a new organization called the Ichiwa-kai. Overnight, the Yamaguchi-gumi had lost thousands of members, and a new rival had appeared that was large enough to challenge it directly. Takanaka responded with a strategy that was both practical and psychologically astute. He offered a full pardon to any departed member who chose to return. He introduced retirement payments for members, something that senior Yakuza had never before been offered. The tactic worked. Members returned in large numbers. The Ichiwa-kai shrank from a force of several thousand to roughly 2,800, but Yamamoto, the Ichiwa-kai's leader, was not willing to accept a slow decline. On January 26, 1985, 4 black cars pulled up in front of an apartment complex in Osaka. Takanaka and two of his most senior associates were standing near the building's elevator. Gunmen opened fire. All three were hit. One associate died immediately. The second died hours later. Takanaka survived 9 hours of surgery, receiving blood donations from Yamaguchi-gumi members who rushed to the hospital before he too succumbed to his wounds. In a single coordinated strike, the Yamaguchi-gumi's top leadership had been eliminated. What followed was the Yama-ichi War, the deadliest gang conflict in modern Japanese history. The Yamaguchi-gumi quickly elected a temporary leader, Nakanishi Kazuo, who immediately declared war on the Ichiwakai. Over the course of a single year, more than 200 armed attacks were recorded between the two organizations. 38 people lost their lives before the violence finally subsided. During this same period, the Yamaguchi-gumi was involved in one of the more surreal episodes in the history of international organized crime. Senior members traveled to Hawaii in an attempt to purchase a large cache of weapons, including rocket launchers, from what they believed were arms dealers. The sellers were, in fact, American undercover agents. The sting operation made international headlines. 2 senior Yamaguchi-gumi members were prosecuted in the United States. At trial, the defense claimed there had been a cultural misunderstanding of the Japanese language and that the defendants had actually been in Hawaii to hire Michael Jackson for a performance. The jury, suspecting entrapment, acquitted them. Despite the acquittal, the incident cost the organization significant money and reputation. Back in Japan, the incident that ultimately ended the Yama-ichi War was not a negotiated truce, but a murder so gratuitously brutal that even the hardened Yamaguchi-gumi recoiled. A former Yamaguchi-gumi member who had defected to the Ichiwakai was found killed near a site known as Bonsai Cliff, where in 1944, hundreds of Japanese civilians and soldiers had thrown themselves to their deaths rather than surrender to American forces. The desecration of that location was apparently a line that could not be crossed. The Yamaguchi-gumi called for peace. The Ichiwakai, by then diminished to a fraction of its former strength, accepted. By 1989, the war was over, and the Ichiwakai had shrunk into something that barely resembled a functional gang. That same year, the Yamaguchi-gumi elected Watanabe Yoshinori as its 5th-generation boss. Under Watanabe, membership climbed to 20,000 as the organization entered the 1990s. But the world around the Yakuza was changing in ways that even the most adaptable criminal organization could not entirely control. The unwritten agreement that had governed the relationship between organized crime and Japanese society for decades was under severe strain. The gang wars of the 1980s had been too public, too violent, and too disruptive to civilian life. The Japanese public's tolerance, never explicitly granted but implicitly maintained through decades of willful blindness, was eroding. In 1991, the Japanese government took its first significant legislative action against the Yakuza with the Betrayal, formerly known as the Act on Prevention of Unjust Acts by Organized Crime Group Members. The law allowed the government to officially designate Yakuza groups as Boryokuden, or violent groups, and imposed restrictions on specific activities. It became illegal to collect protection fees through intimidation. It became illegal to charge money for allowing a member to leave a gang. The practice of demanding yubitsume as a condition of departure was explicitly banned. For the first time in Japanese history, the Yakuza were officially recognized in law as a social problem, but the legislation had significant limitations. It could not directly target Yakuza finances. Assets remained largely untouchable. Penalties were modest, and the Yakuza adapted with characteristic efficiency. They established front companies. They instructed members to formally resign from the organization on paper while continuing to operate on its behalf. The Yamaguchi-gumi even distributed a handbook to its affiliates, explaining how to circumvent the new laws. The organization sent faxes to subsidiary families, telling them to prepare by establishing corporate fronts before the legislation took effect. The result was paradoxical. While the media and police celebrated headlines about Yakuza members quitting and gangs disbanding, the reality was more complicated. Most of the groups that dissolved were small and insignificant. The larger organizations, particularly the Yamaguchi-gumi, the Inagawa-kai, and the Sumiyoshi-kai actually consolidated power before the new laws. These three groups accounted for approximately 45% of all gang membership in Japan. Afterward, that figure jumped to 65%. By 1994, roughly 80,000 people were still identified as Yakuza members or associates. About half of them were employed through front companies and were, according to some analysts, committing more crimes than those who remained formally affiliated with the gangs. In the decade that followed, the Yakuza demonstrated a capacity for survival that confounded law enforcement. Japan's economy entered a prolonged recession in the early 1990s, and the government's response inadvertently channeled enormous sums of money into Yakuza-accessible industries. Over the course of the decade, Japan invested an estimated $3.5 trillion in public works projects to stimulate growth. An estimated 1 to 5% of that money ended up flowing to Yakuza-related construction businesses. For the yamaguchi-gumi, deeply embedded in the construction industry since Tauka's era, this represented billions of dollars in revenue. By the year 2000, the organization's membership had reached approximately 34,000. The Yakuza also demonstrated something else during this period, something that complicated any simple narrative about criminal organizations. In January 1995, a massive earthquake struck Kobe, killing more than 6,000 people and devastating the city that the Yamaguchi-gumi called home. The government's response was slow and disorganized. The regional governor, a member of the Socialist Party who was reluctant to deploy military forces, delayed mobilizing the self-defense forces. Official relief took days to reach some of the hardest-hit neighborhoods. The Yamaguchi-gumi was on the ground within hours. Members distributed hot meals directly from the organization's offices. They patrolled the streets to deter looting. They used boats and even helicopters to reach areas that were inaccessible by road. For many residents of Kobe, the Yakuza were the first responders in the worst disaster of their lives. 16 years later, when the catastrophic earthquake and tsunami struck northeastern Japan in March 2011, the Yakuza again mobilized ahead of the government. The Inagawa-kai dispatched 25 trucks carrying tons of food, water, diapers, batteries, and supplies to the devastated Tohoku region. The Yamaguchi-gumi contributed relief more quietly through civilian intermediaries, mindful of the intensifying scrutiny from police. One anonymous member told a journalist that he wanted the donations to be as discreet as possible, so no one would refuse them out of fear of association with the Yakuza. These actions were not altruistic in the conventional sense. They were strategic investments in public legitimacy. They were demonstrations that the Yakuza served a function the state could not always fulfill. They were also, for construction-linked syndicates, an early stake in the massive rebuilding contracts that would inevitably follow every disaster. But for the people who received food and water when their government had not yet arrived, the motivation behind the delivery was, in that desperate moment, beside the point. This is one of the ways that organized crime survives across generations, not through violence alone, but through the exploitation of institutional failure. When the state is absent, someone else fills the gap, and the price of that service is collected later, in silence and in complicity. The pressure on the Yakuza intensified significantly in the following years. Between 2009 and 2011, every one of Japan's 47 prefectures enacted what became known as Yakuza exclusion ordinances. These laws represented a fundamental shift in strategy. Rather than targeting the Yakuza directly through criminal prosecution alone, the ordinances targeted the entire ecosystem that sustained them. Businesses were prohibited from conducting any transactions with designated Yakuza members or their associates. Banks could refuse to open accounts. Landlords could terminate leases. Mobile phone companies could cancel contracts. Insurance providers could deny coverage. Even utility companies in some jurisdictions were empowered to cut service. The ordinances also imposed consequences on civilians and businesses that maintained relationships with the Yakuza. A company found to be providing services to a Yakuza-affiliated entity could be publicly named, fined, and stripped of licenses. Perhaps most importantly, the ordinances included a provision treating any individual as a Yakuza member for 5 years after they formally departed the organization, closing the loophole that had allowed members to resign on paper while continuing to operate. The American government added further pressure. In 2011, President Obama issued an executive order designating the Yakuza as a significant transnational criminal organization and authorizing the Treasury Department to freeze their assets. The impact of these combined measures was substantial. The social and economic infrastructure that had supported the Yakuza for decades began to erode. Members found themselves unable to rent apartments, open bank accounts, obtain credit cards, or access basic financial services. Their children were stigmatized in schools. Their families were affected by association. The cost of membership, once offset by the promise of income, protection, and status, became increasingly difficult to justify. In 2005, Watanabe retired as the fifth-generation boss and was succeeded by Tsukasa Shinobu, who became the sixth and current Kamicho of the Yamaguchi-gumi. Tsukasa has maintained a lower profile than his predecessors. In 2015, a group of senior members staged a revolt against his leadership, breaking away with approximately 1,000 followers to form the Kobe Yamaguchi-gumi. The dispute remains unresolved, and police continue to monitor both factions closely. The numbers tell the larger story more precisely than any individual event. In 1963, at their absolute peak, the Yakuza had approximately 184,000 members and associates across Japan. By 1991, that number had fallen to roughly 91,000. By 2020, it had dropped below 26,000. By 2024, the National Police Agency reported just 9,900 full members and 8,900 quasi-members. The average age of a Yakuza member at the end of 2022 was 54 years. Only 5% were in their 20s. More than half were 50 or older. The Yakuza are not merely declining, they are aging toward extinction. Young Japanese people are overwhelmingly choosing not to join. The economic incentives that once made the Yakuza an attractive path for men who had no other options have been systematically dismantled by the exclusion ordinances. The social stigma that now attaches to membership, and the reality that the costs of being a Yakuza in modern Japan now vastly exceed any conceivable benefit. But decline is not disappearance. The Yakuza have adapted before, and there are indications they are doing so again. Front companies remain active in construction, real estate, and financial services. Fraud schemes, particularly those targeting elderly victims through sophisticated phone scams and online deception, have become a significant and growing revenue source. Yakuza-affiliated individuals have been linked to cybercrime, identity theft, and the exploitation of personal data. In 2007, Japanese media reported that the head of a Yakuza faction had gained control of an online platform and obtained access to the personal information of 3.5 million users. The potential for extortion was obvious. The construction industry, despite decades of reform, remains penetrated. After the 2011 Fukushima nuclear disaster, reports emerged that Yakuza-affiliated labor brokers were supplying workers for the dangerous cleanup at the damaged reactors, recruiting from among the homeless and undocumented laborers who had no leverage to refuse the work or demand proper safety protections. The exploitation was not incidental. It was systematic, and it demonstrated something essential about how organized crime operates in modern economies. The Yakuza no longer need to control entire industries the way Taoka once controlled the port of Kobe. They need only to control the margins, the spaces where regulation is weakest, where labor is most vulnerable, and where the line between legitimate enterprise and criminal exploitation is thinnest. The cost of the Yakuza's existence across more than 3 centuries cannot be measured solely in dollars or arrests. The narcotics trade devastated communities and fueled waves of addiction. The sex industry, which the Yakuza controlled in various forms for decades, was sustained by the exploitation and trafficking of women, including those brought from other countries under false pretenses. The extortion rackets bled small businesses dry and intimidated entire commercial districts into paying for the privilege of operating without interference. The loan sharking operations trapped desperate borrowers in cycles of debt that destroyed families. The political connections corroded democratic institutions, creating zones of impunity where the interests of criminal organizations were given weight alongside, and sometimes above, the interests of ordinary citizens. And the culture of silence that surrounded the Yakuza for generations, the willingness of business leaders, government officials, police, and everyday people to look the other way because confrontation was uncomfortable, dangerous, or simply not worth the trouble, made all of it sustainable. The Yakuza did not build their empire through violence alone. They built it through the tacit acquiescence of a society that preferred a certain kind of order to the messier work of justice. They built it through the complicity of institutions that found it easier to accommodate organized crime than to dismantle it. And they built it through the silence of millions of people who knew what was happening in their cities, in their industries, in their neighborhoods, and chose not to speak. Today, the Yamaguchi-gumi still occupies its compound in Kobe. The gates remain closed, the cameras still watch the street, but the compound is quieter now than it has been in decades. The membership rolls are thinner, the revenue streams are narrower, the political protection is weaker, the laws are tighter, and the young men who might once have walked through those gates, seeking the belonging and status that mainstream society denied them, are increasingly choosing not to come. Whether the Yakuza will finally disappear from Japanese society, or whether they will once again transform into something adapted to the digital economy and the globalized criminal underworld, remains an open question. What is not open to question is the damage they have left behind. More than 300 years of organized crime, woven so deeply into the fabric of a nation that separating the two has required not just new legislation, but a fundamental reckoning with what an entire society was willing to tolerate and for how long. The Yakuza were never simply combated. For most of their history, they were accommodated. And the price of that accommodation was paid not by the politicians who maintained the arrangement, not by the executives who wrote the checks, not by the police who looked the other way, but by the workers on the docks who had no union to protect them, by the addicts in the cities who had no treatment to save them, by the women in the clubs who had no authority to free them, by the small business owners who paid because refusal was not survivable, and by the communities that lived for generations in the shadow of a power they were never supposed to acknowledge. That is what an empire built on silence looks like when you finally examine it clearly, not from the inside, where the rituals and the hierarchy and the code create an illusion of order and honor, but from the outside, where the consequences are real, where the victims are uncounted, and where the silence is not a choice, but a condition imposed by power on those who had none.